So yes, I'll be talking about irrigation and autocracy, and this is a joint work with Jeanet, Bentzen and Nicolai Kaarsen, who are also at the University of Copenhagen. But let me start by showing you two pictures. So I hope you can see this. On the left-hand side is what I will be talking about today, namely irrigation. This is an aerial photo of the River Nile in Egypt. And as you hopefully can see in the picture, you have the river in the middle and then this narrow band of really fertile fields, and then comes the desert. And this sort of band of fields is made possible, of course, by water from the river, but the water has been allocated by man-made canals and dams to the fields. The other picture is from my home country, Denmark, and this is how we water our crops in Denmark. It rains all the time, basically, so the allocation of water is completely different from what we see in Egypt. And this is my claim, and what I will argue in this paper. It has great implications for the institutions that emerge. And just before we go any further, I will just say irrigation can nowadays take many forms. I mean, this kind of irrigation, dams or canals, that's sort of the old-fashioned one. Modern irrigation use electric pumps and sprinklers and so on. So that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about traditional irrigation methods based on surface water and gravity. So, in a nutshell, this is the paper. We show that the societies which has been dependent on irrigation historically, they are more autocratic today than societies where agriculture has been dependent on rain. And this idea is not new. It has an extremely long intellectual history. I mean, you can find sort of traces of it already in the writings of the Greek philosophers and historians as Herodotus. And you can find it in Hegel, Adam Smith and Stuart Mill, but it's mostly famous, argued by Karl Marx, who called the Asiatic mode of production, or that was a part of his theory of the Asiatic mode of production, and by a sociologist called Karl Wittfogel, who wrote a book in the 50s, I think, called Oriental Despotism, arguing that these riverine societies we see in the Orient, like Mesopotamia, India, China, Egypt, they really have strongly autocratic institutions compared to Europe because of these irrigation systems. But so far, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence on this link between irrigation and institutions. So what we do in this paper is to test this this hypothesis empirically using modern statistical methods. And we do so in 3 different data sets, one across countries, one within countries, and one in pre-modern societies. And sort of the way we think about this link between irrigation and institutions is sort of in the same way that people think about the resource curse. So there's this idea that oil discoveries tend to make countries more autocratic because the elite gain control of this resource and the resource rent, and that they use these rents to entrench themselves in power. So this is sort of the same idea we think, the same thing we think that's going on with irrigation. This is also the outline of this talk, just in reverse order. So first I will talk a bit about sort of the theoretical reasons why we should believe there's this link between irrigation and institutions. Then I will sort of tell you about our empirical strategy and our identification, and then I'll show you the results. I will not talk so much about this history of thought. That's not my specialty. All right. So, and by the way, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions along the way. We're currently revising the paper, so all comments would be appreciated. So I think the best way to illustrate the mechanism we have in mind is with this quote we found in an old book by a geographer named Commodore Fisher. And he was a high school teacher, I think, in Persia in the early 20th century. And he has this this quote here, I will read it aloud. Because of the expense and difficulty of cooperative effort on the part of the small landowners, these irrigation systems are privately owned and tend to perpetuate the feudal system which is well organized in Persia today. A wealthy family can purchase an extensive tract of desert land, make a large investment in a water system, and attract hundreds of tenants who are eager to make their homes around the water supply. Under the need of water and the difficulty of securing it, these tenants are easily reduced to virtual slavery. So this quote contains several facts about irrigation. First of all, it has large fixed costs, so it's usually the elite that has the means to invest in it. It has high returns because if you don't have access to water, then you're not able to do any agriculture. What you build is infrastructure, so it's easy to gain a monopoly because you don't build a canal next to the other canal. That's sort of not feasible. And sort of the consequences of all this is that you get this polarization in sort of economic outcomes and political power. So just to sum that up, you have large fixed cost, it's easy to monopolize, and you have high returns. There's also another argument for this link between irrigation and an institution made by Maesha and Omar Moal, who I believe has presented this paper here, right?
He presented a paper about Egypt indeed, but yeah, it was Maesha, yeah, it was that paper.
Yeah, so he has a paper where he has this case about Mesopotamia and a model which shows that because irrigation is spatially concentrated, as you saw in the picture from Egypt, it's sort of like this very narrow band on both sides of the Nile. And yields in the irrigation system are really predictable because you know exactly how much water is allocated to each field. It's not as predictable when you have rainfed agriculture because rain is random. So this meant that it's really easy to monitor the effort of the peasants on the land. So absentee landlordism becomes really attractive, and in practice that means, but then when you have these irrigation systems, you also often see serfdom or outright slavery.
I think the argument they made in that paper, because I remember it being presented, one of the arguments was that you could observe the level to which Nile was rising.
Yeah.
And they were measuring this. But once you know how much water there was in the Nile, you more or less know how much harvest you could have in that area, and that helped reduce the tax evasion, because they more or less knew. You could not cheat as much, right? It was and that allowed the creation of a large centralized state because it was able to it was a very efficient taxation system.
Yeah. So yeah, just to so the consequence. Okay, I can't go back. Right. So no going back here. The consequences of these characteristics are basically that you have these irrigation systems monopolized by the elites. The elites can use their monopoly power to extract rents from the peasants, and that could be both in the form of taxes or fees for water use, but more often than not it was probably coerced labor or slavery or some crop sharing arrangements. That meant that you got this really unequal distribution of income and political power, and because the elites sort of had all the income, all the power, they set up institutions to entrench this power. So what they really wouldn't like is democracy, because democracy often meant that the peasant wanted land reform, and that would take away these resource rents from the elites. So they will try to set up authoritarian institutions that prevents democracy.
There's one, if I may jump in.
Sure.
There's one more when you speak about rent in this context. One feature of this situation is that it's indeed like oil in some sense. So you as the elite, you have some expense and fixed cost. It's like drilling. But instead of drilling vertically, you drill horizontally. But once you've done that, once you've paid this money, covered the fixed cost, then there's little effort for you as the owner of this infrastructure. You really extract regular, yearly, or monthly, whatever payments from the peasants without doing much. And that's a very important feature. This not without doing much is a very important feature of the dynamics that emerge in this kind of situations. I know you showed the literature in your first slide, and that was this was very important.
And that's a very good analogy too for drilling horizontally rather than vertically, right?
Yeah, we should actually have that in the paper. we sort of use oil as an example as well. So that's a fun comment. Right. So, of course, this still matters in societies where agriculture is still important, which happens to be in the most low-income and many middle-income countries today. But we argue that it also, and we show that it also matters in industrialized countries today. So, even if a country is not that dependent on agriculture anymore, you can still trace the effect of irrigation on present-day institutions. And the reason is institutional persistence. So, following the work of Asger Moll and Johnson and Robertson in the year 2001, I think, there's been this boom in papers showing institutions are persistent. Papers by Melissa Dell, Nathan Nunn, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that's a good reason to believe that institutions are persistent. So, these the institutions that had emerged 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, they can still be here even if irrigation is not a big part of reality today. Yeah.
I'm not very familiar with this literature, so I have the question: how can you really know that it's institutions which are not changing? Because we just last week or 2 weeks ago we had a speaker who was speaking about the persistence of social capital. He showed that so at least there is a huge strand of literature which says that social capital is extremely persistent over centuries, which means if you don't have it or if it gets destroyed, you won't get it back for centuries. And so how do you, I think an institution is easy to change, right? I mean, Georgia shows how you can change institutions and it really works. The institution is different now. So how do you know that these persistencies are not due to social capital or some cultural factors?
Two things. First, I mean, in this literature, institution is sort of very broad, so social capital might be a part of it, the story. But in most of these papers, they're empirical, and they use sort of the institutions colonial power set up in the colonies as exogenous variations. So they use, I'll give you some example later, but sort of the first paper that sort of argued this was the paper I was referring to before by Asger Moll and his co-authors, where they use the mortality rate of settlers, European settlers in different countries as an instrument for the institution they set up. And the argument is that if it's deadly to live somewhere, then the settlers wouldn't move there. That meant that they would set up these really small administrative units and they would sort of just try to extract all the wealth out of the country as possible. But in places like North America and New Zealand, the climate was very hospitable for European settlers, so there they would sort of migrate to in droves and set up sort of inclusive institutions from their home countries. And this is just one example, but there's tons of papers using these using instrumental variable approaches to instrument which kind of institutions, colonial powers they implemented, and show that this can be traced to the present day as well.
Actually, I'm at the danger of not getting to the quantitative part. I can't resist. The argument that actually is even stronger. And the guys who were writing on the non-quantitative side of things, they were blamed for geographic determinism. Because the claim is, or the theory is that over time institutions did change. In the following sense, as we discussed just a moment ago, the fact that the elite did not have to do much effort to maintain this kind of infrastructure. Over time, the elite got lazy. and stopped maintaining this infrastructure at the quality at which it had to be maintained. And in this particular setup of irrigation systems, if you stop maintaining the system, what you get is floods that are actually disastrous for the economy, because they can sweep, not just irrigate, but there's too much water. They will destroy. And so what happens, it's not just the formal side of things, but also there is the social cohesion in a society. Within this context, there's a total disruption. And there is a cycle, basically, of like 150 years, and it's shown for China to actually be sort of consistent over 2,000 something years. But every 150 years, this system declines, and there is a collapse of a dynasty, and so complete disruption of institutions, of everything. Social capital goes to zero. They start fighting each other, basically, and then a new dynasty emerges, builds the infrastructure from scratch. But the geography is the same geography, so they have to face exactly the same problems. So they build it almost from scratch, and for 150 years it's okay, until they get lazy again, and it starts over and over, and it's really shown for China that it's indeed like that.
That's interesting. I would love to see that paper.
It's on the paper, it's in books, but the things that you showed, it's there.
Yeah, so this is just the argument for this institutional persistence. So the elite will try to keep their power, whatever it costs. So they will set up institutions that protect them, or they will try, when the country industrialized, to get a grip of the new industries. Sort of on the flip side, we have this polarization. So instead of having a middle class within the group of people working in agriculture, you get this sort of really poor tenants. That makes it less likely for a middle class to emerge, and that means, because the middle class usually, or claim to be, the ones who are proponents of democratic institutions. When there's no middle class, there's less sort of the elite face less opposition to the institutions they set up. And I mean, this mechanism has been sort of analyzed by others, most notably Sokolov and Engelmann, who argued that this sort of the different development trajectories we see in the Americas is due to the to what crops the people were growing when they were colonized. So we have areas where the climate and the soil favored plantation crops like bananas and sugar. These areas, slavery was really attractive, because in big plantation, slavery is the most efficient way of organizing production, at least if you're the plantation owner. If you compare to North America or Uruguay or Argentina, you couldn't grow any of these plantation crops. You grew mainly wheat and rye, and that means that sort of there's no scale returns in growing these kind of crops. So you usually have like really relatively small family farms with independent farmers. So you got a completely different structure of the agriculture in sort of tropical Americas and temperate Americas, and that led to sort of the same mechanism I was just explaining, that you got this polarized society, a lot of inequality, and the plantation owners that sort of got hold of the political system and the economy, and that can still be traced to the present day. And actually there's some interesting empirical papers by Lagerlöf and Soares and Filiberger, who shows that even within the United States, you can see the counties within the United States where there was a lot of slaves before they got emancipated in 1865. They have worse economic outcomes today, they have more corruption, they have poor institutions. So even within the United States, you can see this long-term institutional persistence coming from how agriculture was organized. Ian Banerjee has showed this sort of the same thing for India. I won't go in the details here. Close to this paper, there's the Meisha and Moll papers. that we discussed before. They have this really neat case about Mesopotamia, where they show that in Upper Mesopotamia, agriculture was rainfed, and there you see lots of independent farms historically. In Lower Mesopotamia, it was fed by Tigris and Euphrates, big rivers, and there have these really centralized states which controlled all aspects of production, essentially. There are some political scientists, Harper of Stanford and Christian Wilsel, have sort of done some empirical tests on this idea that areas where you can grow crops, which usually are areas, where you can grow cereals like wheat and rye, that's usually areas where you've got an intermediate level of precipitation and you have a temperate climate. So they have some empirical tests of this link between cereals and institutions. So I won't go into details about their stories, but in our empirical work we sort of embed their specifications and show that sort of our irrigation measure dominates their measure.
Oh, but it's like they show, I mean, just can't go back. But anyway, I mean, they show that there is an optimal level of precipitation, kind of, yeah?
Yeah.
Too much is bad and
that is non-linear effect, but we include that in one of our regression, and it totally dies when you have irrigation in there. Right, so turning to our empirical strategy. So what we would like to estimate is the quality of institution as a function of how dependent on irrigation a society is and a bunch of control variables. And this is perhaps harder than it looks. First of all, we don't really have any good measure of irrigation dependence. I mean, okay, it makes sense that Egypt is really dependent on irrigation, but if you want to have data for all countries in the world, how do we do it? There are some data on actual irrigation from published by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. But it's contemporary data, and it covers all kinds of irrigation, not just sort of the traditional irrigation we're interested in, but also modern sorts of irrigation. For instance, in Denmark or the US, I mean, it rains a lot, but you still have these irrigation systems just in case there's an occasional drought. So, I mean, it's not used every year, it's used maybe once every 10 years, but you can't see that in the irrigation data from FAO. The other thing is that modern irrigation is a poor proxy for historical irrigation. First of all, because the progress of technology, so most of the growth in irrigation has happened in the US or in Western Europe because we have these really low costs technologies that can provide water to the fields in a very decentralized fashion. So I mean, it's really hard to use just actual irrigation just for data reasons. The perhaps bigger problem is that actual irrigation is endogenous. So if you are an authoritarian leader, you're probably able to capture more of the rents from irrigation than a democratic society. So you would be more inclined to invest in irrigation. So just estimating actual irrigation, having actual irrigation as our explanatory variable could be biased in thousands of possible ways. So our solution to this problem is that we use a measure we construct of irrigation potential. And this measure is based on exogenous variation in climate, in soil suitability, in terrain ruggedness, and so on. So it's completely exogenous to whatever institutions are in the country. It's also exogenous to what they actually do in agriculture. It's just based on climatic data and soil data, basically. So what people would normally do in this kind of analysis is use this variable as an instrument for actual irrigation. We do so as a robustness check, but I won't show you the result in this presentation for two reasons. First of all, at the country level, we have a weak instrument problem because the way you construct our irrigation potential data is to only sort of capture areas where you use the traditional irrigation methods. But the actual data is sort of all kinds of irrigation. So there's not so good correlation with that because it's measuring two different things. The other problem, it's not a problem, but this is an exactly identified setting, so the IV estimate is just a rescaling of the reduced form coefficients. So no IV in this presentation. It's in the paper, but if you're interested, you can look back. But it works. So the data we're using is gridded data from FAO. So the data, FAO has this cool data set of all kinds of climatic and geographic variables at the grid level. So small squares at the equator, they're 9 by 9 kilometers. So it's really detailed data on soil quality, climate, what kinds of crop you can grow, everything basically, water sources, and so on. And for each of these grid cells, FAO computes the irrigation impact, that is, by how much you can improve yields by going from rainfed agriculture to irrigated agriculture, potentially. So it's independent of what people actually do. And then we take this measure from FAO, and then we do some adjustments, and then we aggregate it to the society level. And I will sort of give you the details now. So the way FAO does it is they calculate the potential yields based on all these climatic and geographic data. And they calculate the potential yields for each of the 154 most common crops you grow around the world. And then they figure out which combination of crops is the optimal within each grid cell. And that's sort of the potential yield of that grid cell. And in the calculations, they assume that the level of technology is at what they call the intermediate level, but that I would say that's more or less what we will find in most places 100 years ago. So there's no synthetic fertilizer, there's no heavy machinery, no green revolution stuff, kinds of seeds and that kind of thing. So we're using this because we think it reflects what was going on back in time. And the only different when they do this calculation, they do it both for irrigated conditions and for rain-fed conditions. And the only difference is that any constraints on how much you can grow under rain-fed conditions is relaxed when they calculate irrigated conditions. So it's only about the water source that makes the difference between these two crop yields. So the way they calculate their irrigation impact is just to take the ratio of potential irrigated yields to potential rain-fed yields. So when irrigation impact is high, that means you have a high return to irrigation. Yeah.
But the rain-fed agriculture, they take into account the actual rainfall which you have in that area.
Yeah. So they use the average rainfall from 1960 to 1990, I think.
Could be infinity.
Sorry?
Could be infinite.
The rainfall, or
no,
yeah. So that's why they divide this irrigation impact into impact classes, and there are 5 of them. And infinite would be in impact class 5, where the irrigation impact is about 100%. Yeah, so this is a map of these irrigation impact classes. The light gray here is where agriculture there's no gain from irrigation. It rains so much that you can build all the irrigation systems you want, it wouldn't help.
The rainforest doesn't do much.
True. And then the impact of irrigation rise as you go to more green colors on the map. Dark gray is where you can't have any agriculture at all, either because it's too cold, or the soil is too poor, or the terrain is too rugged. So no agriculture in sort of Greenland and the high Andes and Sahara.
I think your research paper is already projected on the...
Well, in a way that, yes. I mean, so the way we construct our irrigation potential variable for societies is that we only look at the impact class 5 here, which is the dark green one, where the impact of irrigation is above 100%. And we do that because we want to capture areas where you could build irrigation system with the ancient techniques, and we want to capture areas where the returns are so high. The returns are so high that there's a point in doing rent-taking on these irrigation systems. And as you can see, these dark green areas, they are mostly sort of in a band here north of the equator. And in a way, that there's two reasons why the gain from irrigation can be so high. One, no agriculture is possible without it, and two, it allows for multiple harvests. So the reason for having sort of green patches can be a bit different, but these are the two main reasons. So this is how we define irrigation potential. It's the area in impact class 5, the green, dark green on the map, relative to the area suitable for irrigation. I just explain why we choose this high cutoff. The reason why we have areas suitable for irrigation in the denominator is that areas where agriculture is not possible, there's not a lot of people living there, so it doesn't have a lot of impact on institutions in the country. So we want to only look at areas where people are actually living.
So Australia in this case has an irrigation potential close to 1, actually.
I think it's 0.7, sorry, yeah. You said Australia,
probably, right? Uzbekistan is probably 1, or...
No, it's actually, I checked it after our discussion yesterday, and I will show you in a minute, so that's a little teaser. Yeah?
Right. So if a referee would say, why don't you just take the average of the impact class? Why do you construct the measure here which only takes into account impact class 5? What would you answer?
Sure, I would answer that. I mean, if you look at the map, look at the low impact class 2, for instance, here, and in Europe. I mean, there wasn't any irrigation at all until the 70s, basically. So we don't want to capture these areas.
So you argue that only if we have impact class 5, we would have in ancient times already, we would have had this large scale
because those are the areas where it was feasible back in time and where the rents were high. We do a robustness check where we use low impact classes as well, and we find similar results, but the standard errors becomes higher. Yeah. So here's the table I just made for Adam. So these are just examples of irrigation potential in some countries. So the two countries I showed a picture of in the beginning, Egypt and Denmark, are on each end of the scale naturally. And then I picked some countries sort of in the region around here. You can see Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan, they have relatively high irrigation potential, whereas Georgia and Turkey have quite low irrigation potential. And I just made this table, then I looked at it afterwards and said, hey, well, wow, if you look at the institutions these countries have, it sort of fits the idea, right? So the countries at the bottom there have quite democratic institutions, whereas the others are basically autocracies in one way or another, right? So that's the empirical evidence already. But of course we do it a bit, I'll skip this, we do it a bit more complicated way, just to make it seem more academic. So first we look at the country level. And at the country level we use what is called the Polity 2 index from Center of Systemic Peace. So it's essentially an index where they measure democracy on a 21-point scale from minus 10 to plus 10. So 10 would be the most democratic, and 10 is what you see in Denmark, and US, and the UK, Germany, and so on. I think Georgia is 6 or 7, so pretty good. North Korea, -10, so that's the worst country of them all. I think, along with Eritrea and Saudi Arabia, something like that. So the results I will show you, we have averaged the Polity 2 index since 91, because there's some instability, especially that's in countries going from one regime to the other over the period. So we want to sort of capture the long run level of democracy, so to speak. Yeah.
So how many countries are included in this data set?
Let's see. No, it's not here, but 160. So it's fairly representative.
I see. Could you go back? I know it's difficult, but could you go back to the map?
Sure.
So I mean, what is, in my opinion, what is most like against your hypothesis is Africa, right? I mean, you have this big part in Africa where irrigation wouldn't make a difference, in fact, because it's rain-fed, and they're not very democratic there, probably. And what I think now is that if you would, let's say, have the African countries in your data set, but they were all split in two for some reasons, then your outcome might be affected by that. So let's assume this would be only one country. It would almost in no way affect your result, because it's only 1 out of 160.
Mm-hmm.
So the number of countries you have in Africa, which is not really something which it was determined in colonial times in the Vienna Conference or something, so really affects your outcome here. Because Africa, in my opinion, looks as if it is like the main counter argument against your hypothesis.
So you're saying we would get stronger result if we left Africa out, right? Or
I would think so, yeah. If you leave it out, you would get stronger results, right?
We do include a continent dummy, so it sort of takes care of a bit of that, I would say. Yeah, but let's see. If we do a lot. Oops. We have a lot of robustness checks, but we haven't tried to exclude Africa completely. So what we see here up here. Can you read this table, or it's a bit small? So this is just a simple regression of this Polity Democracy Index on irrigation potential, and the coefficient is almost -10, meaning that if you only have irrigation potential in there, you remove 10 points on the 21-point democracy scale when you go from no irrigation potential to full irrigation potential. So the difference between Denmark and Egypt. Of course, there's a lot of confounding variables in here, so we include a lot of controls. So in this first table, we include a lot of geographic controls, because our measure of irrigation potential is constructed based on climate and geography. So maybe it's something that we put into our measure that is driving our results rather than sort of irrigation potential. So we include latitude, precipitation, temperature, soil quality, and continent dummies in this column. I have edited these tables, by the way, because there's so many columns in the paper, so it would fit on slides. So that's why the numbers on the top are a bit different. But what we see, if we include all these geographical variables, all of them are insignificant, but irrigation potential still has a big effect on institutions. It's sort of fallen from -10 to -5, but it's still significant and it's still huge. In the next two columns, 5 and 6, sort of test the Harper method of looking at these intermediate level of precipitation. How these intermediate level of precipitation are sweet spots where you find most democracies. And we do so by including precipitation and squared precipitation, which is not exactly what he does, but almost. And if you don't have irrigation potential in there, as here in column 5, both are significant, and you sort of get the same results. When we do include irrigation potential in the next column, both become insignificant, and they do so jointly. So the test he makes is sort of, in a way, the same as we do, but with a cruder sort of variable, and the story, of course, in our paper is a bit different. In the last column, we also include sort of other sorts of resources that the resource curse literature has found to be cursed. So oil, minerals, and plantation crops. And especially oil, or actually only oil, is highly significant and have a negative influence on institutions, but it doesn't change our estimate of interest on irrigation potential. It's still -5.
So drilling either horizontally or vertically leads to trouble.
Yeah. And if you do both, as in Saudi Arabia, it's big trouble.
It's really trouble.
They have irrigation in Saudi Arabia?
I think they have a little, but I don't know actually.
Do they grow anything at all?
Dates, probably.
Dates.
I mean, they must been living on something before they discovered oil.
Yeah, dates, in this oasis.
Yeah. That would be my guess, at least. All right. So now I will turn to sort of control for history and development. So in this institutional literature, there's a lot of variables that have been suggested to affect institutions today. So here we include real GDP per capita, years since the Neolithic Revolution, the age of the state. So there's this idea: the older the state, the more oppressive it becomes. We include population density in 1500, a dummy for whether the country used to be a colony, and the share of European languages spoken among the population. So the story that's usually told, it's actually in a paper a friend of mine wrote in Journal of American Political Science Review, where he shows that the really strong, the old states, they were stronger and the military powerful when the Europeans started to colonize the world, so they were able to resist European involvement more, and that means that could prevent the Europeans from exporting their institutions. So Europeans exported sort of the legal codes and economic policies to many of the colonies, but some countries were able to prevent this because they were powerful before the Europeans arrived. And because of that, you will usually see a negative relationship.
So I want to repeat my criticism. I'm not sure if you have any answer to that or if there is any way to solve this problem, but let's assume in 1884 in Vienna, in the conference where they decided how many states will be in Africa, if they would have decided that Africa will be 5,000 states, then the data would be completely different, your result. Because you would, in your data set, you would have 5,000 cases where, at least optically, it looks as if some parts in Africa really don't confirm your hypothesis. While if they would have decided to make Africa just one state, then your hypothesis would be even more confirmed than it is right now. And I see a problem here. I mean, you see, it depends on how many states they agreed on in the Vienna conference, whether you will get your result confirmed or not. I mean,
so you're basically arguing we should wait or use population weight in regression or area.
It's very difficult. I'm thinking about it, but it's not easy to find a solution for that problem. If you would, let's say, you would look at square kilometers or something and look whether this square kilometer is ruled by a democracy or by a dictatorship, you would connect it with the irrigation. It would solve the problem, I think. It's difficult, but I mean, okay.
I think that's actually doable with our data, so that's a possibility. But we also have some subnational data that doesn't suffer from this criticism. I'm sure in a minute. All right, but well, now we're speaking of colonization. This is one of my favorite tables in the paper. Here we split the sample in countries that were never colonized and countries that used to be colonies. So we do the same regression, but in two different samples. And what you see is the effect of irrigation potential is enormous in those countries which were never colonized, but it's much smaller in countries that used to be colonies. And this fits very well with the literature on institutions, because what happened is that the Europeans exported their good institutions to their colonies. So because they exported the institution, we should get a noisy signal from the sort of the geography of the institution that was prevalent before the Europeans came. And that's why we see smaller estimates over here.
You know, this is a very tricky argument to make. You know, next year it will be exactly 100 years since the famous agreement signed in 1916, called the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement, that divided the Middle East between France and the UK. So if we wait another year, I think what we see now is already the unraveling of this agreement, because all the borders in the Middle East, not all, but you see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So if you, and the kind of regime that emerge as a result of colonial meddling and export of institutions are totally undemocratic. I mean, these are the kind of regimes that cut off people's heads. And, yeah. So you know, this export of colonial institutions had 100 years of influence of the positive kind, but when they unravel, as seems to be happening now, it goes just the other direction. It goes to the extreme.
Mm-hmm.
So next year, if you rerun this next year,
yeah, but well, it's still. Oh, you're right. I mean, you're right about the sign here, but the point is that you get noise into the system by exporting European institutions, whether it becomes good or bad. So I mean,
it's
well,
like short term, long term. Yeah, that's the.
Also, we don't know yet what will happen in the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, a few years ago we called it the Arab Spring, and we believed everything would turn out democratically.
Now it's winter.
We don't know yet. I mean.
This business of exporting institutions is a very tricky one.
Indeed.
The Americans know that well.
So next thing we do is to control for religion, basically the shares of people in the population with different religions. So we have Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Buddhism here. Sort of the most widely spread religions globally. And what you I mean, there's plenty of people who tell stories about how religion affects economic outcomes or institutions. And usually Protestantism is good. That was what Max Weber thought. We do find some correlation here, I would call it. The other story people tell is that Islam is bad. And we do find small negative correlations.
It's politically incorrect.
It is political, but I would emphasize here these are correlations. But what you see in this table is that we still have our significance on irrigation potential, but the significant levels fall when we include Islam. And the reason is, if you think back on the map, Islam is sort of in this belt from Morocco to Pakistan. And this is also sort of the belt where you find the most potential for irrigation. So the question we always get in this situation is, well, isn't this a problem for you guys? And of course, we don't think so. And we don't think so for two reasons. First, it has been shown recently by different authors, different scholars, that both the spread of Islam and the tenets of Islam, they're basically endogenous. So Jeanet and Nicolai, they argue that Islam spread in areas where you had desert ecology, because that's where you can use the camel, for instance, and that's where the trade routes were when the sort of the Arab world was the bridge between Europe and Asia. So Islam starts out somewhere in the Arab Peninsula, and then it spreads in these areas where you also find irrigation. Secondly, there's a bunch of papers by Nicolai.
Wait, I mean, what's the connection? Why should Islam be more successful in areas where we have desert?
Because it was able to redistribute. We see exactly that point.
This from the starting
bullet.
point.
It was able to redistribute. And it was able to support the central authority, which was essential if you wanted to have a stable statehood.
But for the first one, there's just an initial starting point, right? I mean, the Arabian Peninsula, going up from there, it's quite similar ecology.
So what you're saying is that if Islam or Christianity are competing for a region, that Islam has an advantage if that region is desert, because then the agenda of Islam performs better than the agenda of Christianity.
That's the argument of Nicolai and his co-authors, precisely. The other argument that Jeanet makes and others is that the Arabs were basically traders, so they have this trade route based on camels, and so did the Arab armies, for instance. So the Arab army, they would be riding camels to get to another country, and they couldn't do that as well or they had a comparative advantage in areas where the deserts were.
So, I mean, there are people who claim that Islam and democracy are not doing very well with one another. So there are, I think, 26 states in the world which have state religion of Islam, and the most democratic of them is Turkey, I think. And democracy is quite dysfunctional there. So the standard link which is made is to say, well, Islam somehow, the culture of Islam, the agenda of Islam is not fostering democracy. But could it be, through this link, could it be that Islam is doing well in regions which are like desert or where
which need a central authority and which need redistribution? That's exactly the hypothesis here.
Okay, so it's not about it's not about
Islam is endogenous to the conditions in which of life and agriculture and everything. That's exactly the argument.
That's exactly the point. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but Islam spread in areas with desert ecology. Other religions also, before it was Christianity, in the same area, right?
Yeah.
So what's the argument in those papers? I didn't get.
So the argument is that Arab traders and Arab armies were based on the road camels, so it was easier to travel in desert areas. The second argument is that sort of the tenets of Islam were more appealing to people living in such areas, because they had this redistributive aims where they redistributed from sort of the rich to the poor.
No, like before Christianity, those Arabs were Christians, right? Then Islam changed and then occupied everything. Why it is like it's the same area, right? Why it is?
Yeah,
Christianity also had, the early Christianity also had a very strong redistribution aspect. I mean, early Christianity clearly was not about central authority, because it was a movement of, it was a grassroots religion. It wasn't a state religion. So the question is why Christianity was adopted in certain places as a state religion, Byzantium or whatever it was.
I find this argument very strange. Also, your argument, you say Islam does well with central authorities, but then there should be something in Islam, like something in the Quran or somewhere, which does well with central authorities. And I don't know what you're talking about here. I mean, if I look at these religions, it's not obvious that there are such differences. I mean, so central authority and also being successful in, let's say, dry areas or desert areas. Why? There should be something in Islam, right? In the Quran, there should be something in the Bible which makes these different competing belief systems differently successful in different areas. And I really have no idea what we're speaking about here. I mean, so
it doesn't have to be in the Quran. It could just be sort of the way people have transported stuff. I mean, it doesn't have, and they just happen to be Muslim or Christian.
Yes, yeah, so that's like the initial starting point with these first few papers there. I mean, as you're starting out in the Arabian Peninsula, right? I mean, that shows trade networks and transfer networks was very much
strange. But camel were the same people, like in Ethiopia, for example. It was Christian, right? The same people using same camels. Why? Yeah.
No, camel is not cannot do much. I mean, it's not about the camels. Yeah, cannot be about the camels. Unless.
Well, and of course, our second argument here is that we have subnational evidence. I'll show you in a minute, where we still find the results, and we can control for whether a region or a country is Muslim or not. So let's turn to some national evidence, and we have two data sets. One is the ethnographic atlas, which is a compilation of ethnographies, is it, compiled by an anthropologist, Murdoch, where he took sort of everything that anthropologists and ethnographers had discovered about societies around the world up to that date, and he sort of tried to quantify it and made a data set based on that. So I think in total he has this database on, I think it's 1,260 something societies scattered around the globe, and he's quoted a lot of variables about the characteristics of these societies. And the crucial thing here is that most of these observations are from the 19th or early 20th century, so it's before Europeans really had a big influence of these societies. They're selected to be areas where Europeans doesn't have much influence in that time period where they were surveyed. From this data set, we use a variable that measures how the stratification in the society was when it was observed. And there are 5 categories, and we choose, we construct a dummy variable for whether social stratification was based on an elite which controlled resources, basically land. And each society, the atlas also provides coordinates for each society. So for each society you can construct a circle around it, and we measure irrigation potential within that circle. And just to sort of cross-check this measure of institutions with the polity 2 index we use at the national level, we have, for each modern day country, we have averaged these stratification variables for each society within that country. So that in the atlas there are these 5 different ways society can be stratified, and I think you can have never mind. At least 5 different ways: absence among free men, wealth distinctions, elite control of resources, dual, and complex.
What's the first one? Absence? What is it?
It means that there's no social stratification among free men, basically. It's a bit diffuse.
No stratification.
No stratification. But then comes this disclaimer among free men, so that might be slavery. I don't know really what that's measuring. So you sort of, this is elite control of resources or elite control of land. It's exactly what we want to measure. So we picked that one, and this was a sort of a lucky strike. It has a significant negative relationship at the country level to the polity 2 index today. So you have this sort of persistent of institutions from maybe in the 19th century to democracies today. Yeah, so these are the results we get. So if you just, the simple, so we have 770 societies scattered around the globe. The reason why the number is lower than in the ethnographic atlas is that we have excluded all societies of hunters and gatherers, basically. And then there's a few societies where we have missing data. So the simple relationship here between irrigation potential and a dummy for elite stratification, it's, the coefficient is significant at the 1% level, and it's 1.17, which means that there's approximately a 17% higher chance of a society being ruled by an elite than something else. Yeah.
So is the dependent variable the same in the 2 estimations?
The dependent variable,
yes.
No, this is a dummy for whether society was sort of controlled by an elite who owned the resources. So it's a different variable, but this variable correlates with the other variable at the country level, but we don't have the other ones.
The first variable in the previous, what was the dependent variable? What was it?
In the cross-country irrigations,
Yes, yeah.
That was the polity 2 index, this 21% scale.
I see.
But we don't have that at the country level and only today.
Certification.
I see. Okay.
So we use this instead here. And then we have information on the language of all these societies. So a language is usually a marker of culture and religion and so on. So we include language dummies for each society. So, I mean, if there should be an effect of being a Muslim society on institutions, it should be captured in this language dummies, by these language dummies. And what we see when we include them, the estimate of interest actually doubles to get a much larger effect. So this estimate is the estimate of effective irrigation potential within societies which speak the same language, have the same culture. Then we add all the geographical variables from the first analysis, plus some controls for the size, settlement size, sort of the sophistication of the society, and the level of sort of technology they use in agriculture, whether they have a plow, sort of captured by this variable. And if you throw everything in there, we still have a highly significant effect of irrigation potential on the likelihood of being ruled by a resource controlling elite. All right, so the last piece of evidence is based on data from the World Values Survey. So this is a survey that asks individuals in a large number of countries around the world about sort of their cultural perceptions and all kinds of cultural questions. So in this survey, they're asking questions about people's attitudes to democracy. So in particular, they ask about whether people think democracy is a good thing, and whether democracy, despite its problems, is better than other forms of government. So these are the two variables we use in our analysis. And it has been, I mean, because I mean the survey is done across countries, so it's a bit hard to compare these questions to actual institutions. But there are some evidence that these correlate with institutions at the local level, but it's mostly sort of anecdotal evidence by political scientists. So it has not completely been tested that these attitudes actually maps into actual local institutions. Yeah.
So the argument would be that democracy is something I start to like once I have it. So I need to, if I'm living under a dictatorship, I don't appreciate democracy. That's the idea here, right?
That could be one way of framing it, yeah.
It could be just the other way around.
It could.
Just the other way around.
It could. But there are
so
some.
Maybe democracy isn't better. I mean, maybe I like democracy, but maybe you would put me in a dictatorship for some years. I would start liking that one,
You
right?
change your mind. So, I mean, it's really hard to find. I mean, the way we think about it is that if you are sort of a semi-democratic country or a nominal democratic country, then you might like democracy better if the institutions at the local level functions. So that's sort of my way of thinking about it. But I mean, the link here is it's not completely obvious, but there are some anecdotal evidence that this should be the case. There should be a link between the perception of democracy and the actual level of democracy. So what we do, we don't know exactly like the house people live in, but we know the region people live in. So we can calculate irrigation potential at the regional level within a country, and then see if the perceptions of the individuals living in that region differ from people in the same country, but in another region of the country. On average, there's T regions per country, and the benefit of this is, of course, that we can include country dummies. So the results I'll show you now are basically variation within the same countries. Oh, another thing. we get the design we should expect, namely that if you have a high irrigation potential, then people are less likely to think democracy is a good thing. So there's another whole lot of stars in this row here, and I spoke with one of my co-authors the other day, and she said she had improved on the way we merge the world value survey data with the geographical data, meaning we got more observations and that turned all these estimates into significant at the 1% level, I think. So these results are weaker than the one we actually have now. But anyway, we have a country fixed effect in here, we have individual controls, education level, income level, age, gender, occupation, and we have the geographical control from before precipitation, the region, temperature, and so on. And we still have the link between irrigation potential and sort of the perceptions of institutions. So that's the last piece of evidence I have so far.
And being Muslim is positive.
Yeah, that's the other curious thing actually, which I quite like. So to conclude, we have what I've shown here, some evidence that all these, some of the ancient thinkers who thought about this Oriental despotism or Asiatic mode of production, they were actually onto something, and the effect is still there today. It's still important. And sort of the way we think about it is that this is sort of a manifestation of the resource curse, and the resource curse still applies even though societies are no longer agrarian, since institutions are persistent. Yes, I think that was about it. So thank you for your attention.